Good afternoon, and welcome to this conversation on revitalizing government and rebuilding the social contract. My name is Maria Cancian, and I have the pleasure of serving as Dean of the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University. This is the first in our series, Imagine the Future, which brings together key thinkers and faculty and friends of the McCourt School to talk about the challenges we face and, importantly, the strategies for moving forward towards a better future. Thank you for joining us for this conversation about the nation's civic capacity and the opportunities to revitalize the capacity of government to bring us together to work towards that better future. We face a combination of social, political, and economic challenges that simultaneously highlight the need for effective collective action and the limited capacity of our public institutions. Our goal this afternoon is to talk through both the problems and the solutions. I am so pleased to welcome so many members of the Georgetown University community and beyond to join us in this timely conversation, and I'm excited for the opportunity to speak with our panelists. I'm going to offer only very brief introductions because they all deserve very lengthy lists of all their accomplishments. But very briefly, Pam Hurd is a professor of public policy at the McCourt School. Her research focuses on inequality and how it intersects with health, aging, and policy. Don Moynihan is the inaugural McCourt Chair at the McCourt School. His research examines how to improve how government works. Pam and Don are co-authors of the book Administrative Burden, which addresses the fundamental importance of good government in supporting democracy. Eduardo Porter is an economics reporter for the New York Times, where he has had a number of roles. He wrote the Economic Scene column from 2012 to 2018. His most recent book is titled American Poison: How Racial Hostility Destroyed Our Promise. So we are here to talk about what's wrong and how to fix it. And I realized as I was thinking last night about this conversation that both the title Administrative Burden and the title American Poison: How Racial Hostility Destroyed Our Promise, those are not very optimistic titles. But I am an optimist by kind of nature. And so I really hope that we will spend time today both talking about the challenges that we face, but also the opportunities to make things better. I'd like to start, since part of our title is Rebuilding the Social Contract. I'd like to start by asking what the social contract is or what it means to all of us. And maybe being a college professor by long-term training, I want to ask everybody in the audience, if they would, to just take a minute to think about what you think the social contract is or means. I won't give you very long to think about it before I ask Pam if she would start by sharing her concept of the social contract and how that would kind of inform our conversation today. Pam?
Yeah, thanks, Maria. I guess for me, when I think about the social contract, I go back to the New Deal and go back to, in some ways, some basic ideas about what makes a healthy functioning democracy. Part of what makes a healthy functioning democracy are the things that we talk a lot about in the US, particularly political and social rights, right? Political rights, right to vote, civil rights, access to commercial institutions like restaurants and businesses and jobs. But there's a sort of third category, which a political theorist, T.H. Marshall, articulated, which is are these sort of social rights. They're these kind of access to really kind of basic needs and basic rights, basic economic rights, basic educational rights, basic healthcare rights. And these are the things basically, that have a roof over your head, to make sure that you have access to healthcare, to make sure that you have enough to eat, that your kids can get an education. All these kinds of basic social rights are critical basically in a healthy democracy, in part because it helps access things like political rights. It allows us to actually engage in democracy in functioning ways. And I think part of that, which stems from the book that Don and I have, is thinking too about what that looks like actually on the ground. So what does it look like when you're actually trying to access these sort of basic rights. So I'll use Social Security as an example, Social Security, the retirement program. You know, that's a program that was designed to provide kind of income security for older adults in retirement. It's our most popular, most effective social welfare poverty reduction policy, and it treats people really respectfully. When you engage with that program, you have a really positive, respectful experience with government. And so to me, those are kind of key components of what I think of when I think of the social contract.
Thank you. And Eduardo, what would you add to that?
Well, I mean, I have this kind of like very cookie cutter first thought of what the social contract is, you know, this set of commitments to one another and to the collective, you know, the rules that limit our behaviors and codify our responsibilities of citizens and also of governments. And this has a lot to do with the provision of public goods as well. But I think I wanted to point out that there's a critical part of the social contract that's kind of like beyond these like set of rules and norms, is the story that we tell each other about who we are as a collective. And the United States has a really unique story. You know, it's a story that is not really shared among other industrialized nations. It's very much part of us, which is this story of the melting pot. You know, this idea that we are, you know, e pluribus unum, that, and this comes back from, you know, that the play by Israel Zangwill, which opened in Washington, D.C. at the Columbia on October 5th of 1908. And it's a kind of a Romeo and Juliet story where you have this Jewish Russian immigrant and a Christian Russian immigrant in New York overcoming what were then likely considered to be vast cultural differences to come together. And there's this famous line from the main character, David Quijano, which he says, Germans and Frenchmen, Irishmen and Englishmen, Jews and Russians, into the crucible with you all. God is making the American. Teddy Roosevelt apparently loved this one. And this tale, to my mind, is moving on to this, where this conversation is going. It reveals kind of exactly how the American social contract ultimately failed its people. Because this story that we've been telling ourselves is pretty much a myth. You know, the indigenous communities that were living in the United States before all the Europeans arrived were not in this pot, nor were the descendants of African slaves or the brown Catholic Mexicans from whom the United States had acquired about a third of its territory about a half a century before. So this alloy had no space for Chinese immigrants who were prohibited from gaining citizenship under the Chinese Exclusion Act. And, you know, not 2 decades after this melting pot idea was gaining traction with this play, Congress passed one of the most limiting immigration policies that kind of like was designed to keep out Jews and other people from Central and Southern Europe, from Asia, from America, from Latin America. And this immigration policy would remain on the books until 1965. So to my mind, and for what I document in my book, American Poison, at some point, is that we have this myth of our own, of who we are as a nation. But at the end of the day, the social contract that we have built, by which I mean the system of rules and responsibilities, both of the collective and of individuals, that fails us because we are not, this story does not really represent us. In fact, our social contract has been built constrained by all these barriers between people of different races and different ethnicities, and that has essentially barred us from providing a set of, you know, sufficient public goods and providing us with a public understanding of everybody as Americans, you know, that has invited everybody into kind of like the idea of the American mainstream.
Not so much. Go ahead, Dan.
Well, I would pick up on that. So I also I moved to America as an immigrant, and so one of the most striking memories I've had is going to the Norman Rockwell Museum to see the paintings of the 4 freedoms and this very idyllic representation of what the social contract could look like. But as we know, of course, there's always been this tension in American history between what we promise, what we put down on paper in the Constitution, and what we actually deliver to each other. And so I think in some sense, if you think of the social contract as something that evokes the idea that we treat each other as citizens, that we take care of each other and protect each other against life's vagaries, we all contribute towards some common project. There's some sort of abstract agreement about that that then starts to maybe fail a little bit when it comes to practice. And I think if you look at the last 4 years and where we've gotten to today, as a candidate, and I hate to be the first person to say President Trump, but President Trump really exploited this idea of a social contract that didn't deliver to you, right? He exploited the idea that the past offered something better. There was a sense of progress that has been sort of taken away from you, but also relying on some of the division that Eduardo talked about, which is that it's being taken away from you by these other people here, that they are a threat to your social contract. But the result of that has been, I think, 4 years of fairly empty populism. It's populism that promised great things to people, to supporters, but really did not invest in programs to redistribute and to protect people against some of the harsher aspects of life. So I think that, go ahead, Pam.
Sorry, no, finish.
I just want to, so I warned you that I was an optimist. So I want to push back a little bit on this concept of a failed promise to say, is this sense of kind of a collective, maybe not a melting pot, but of a collective and of kind of shared commitment, should we think of that as a goal or an aspiration and kind of a worthy goal? An aspiration, I mean, there are places on this globe that don't aspire to everybody, all members, all people who live there having equal access to things. And is it, in some sense, could we argue that really is an aspiration, that there are elements of our policymaking and our government that really do embody that aspiration? Or do you see it really as kind of just a fantasy and a smoke screen for something that's really at odds with that?
Well, this is like the joke about if you want the American dream, you got to move to Canada, right? We inspired the rest of the world with our aspirations and our goals. And I think the question is, do we honor those and sort of try to work towards them as aggressively as some other countries have done over the last 50 years and over the last 4 or 5 years? That there have been, I think, contrasts.
I think it points to the complexity, actually. Partly what I appreciate about, for example, what Eduardo was pointing to is that there always has been this real tension around these kind of varying goals and the way they've actually played out. So even back in the progressive era, the reality is a good chunk of progressives, including academics within institutions I spent a lot of time in, were deeply eugenist. They were the folks who very much supported really restrictive immigration policies and deeply eugenic policies, at the same time that they were pushing for these rules that would keep kids out of the workplace. And it's not like there's this sort of unsullied group of people who push for the expansion of these rights, and then there's this angelic community, or it's complicated. Basically, it's always been complicated, and I think it remains so.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that. That's a very interesting thought, and I think that these tensions are to be expected. I mean, the idea you mentioned the progressive era, but FDR, Roosevelt, kind of like the great hero of American liberalism, embodied these contradictions. I mean, for starters, he, at the beginning, when he started his term, he continued Hoover's a policy of trying to get rid of anybody that had a Mexican name under the assumption that, you get rid of these workers and you get tighter labor markets. But, the whole construction of the New Deal was riven by these borders of race and ethnicity that limited the generosity of pretty much the majority of the whole program to white Americans. And why was that? Well, he did live in a political system in which he needed Southern senators from the Democratic Party, and those tended to be, quite hold very racist ideas and did not really want to extend many of these benefits to people of color. And Roosevelt made the calculation that he would rather have his program than not have his program, and so he cut people of color out. And that continued. I mean, I would argue that continues pretty much until the Civil Rights Movement, when we're on the process of building kind of like a social safety net that would look maybe like it does in other rich countries where it really does provide universal health care and things like that. But then the Civil Rights Movement comes around, the Blacks and other people of color are invited to enjoy in the benefits of citizenship, and sort of like our political system closed down on the idea of a safety net entirely. Like, we got to share it? Well, we'd rather not have one. And so just to circle to your idea, Maria, that started your first question here, is, do I think this is just like a pie in the sky? I mean, maybe, but I think it's an indispensable goal for us. It's a necessary condition for us to be able to build the kind of society that is healthy and has space for everybody. Because otherwise, these divisions are going to continue to constrain us. They constrain us. I mean, still, Dawn was talking a little bit about President Trump's political rhetoric and his nostalgia here. And I would say, well, his nostalgia is a nostalgia for a world in which whites controlled political power, they controlled economic power, nothing was contesting this power. And, the apparatus of government was being designed to serve them. I'm thinking Doris Day era. And that's what he is promising that he will return to, it seems to me. That the goal is, we're going to get rid of all these other things that happened since then. And what are the things that happened since then? Well, immigration on a very, very large scale, civil rights, and basically the changing of the American demographic makeup.
So when you think about moving forward from this, so part of what we need is, what I hear you arguing is, part of what we need is to really accomplish that sense of shared or collective interest, and that would address the ability to build a stronger safety net. I think it would address some of the challenges that Pam and Don raise in their book about administrative burdens and the way that programs are built to not really, in some sense, serve some people as well in some programs, right? So what do you see as the key steps to getting to that better place?
Well, the reason that I say that maybe you're right that this is pie in the sky is that I find that the key step is not at all obvious, at least not at all obvious to me. And it can sound amazingly hand wavy, but I do think that ultimately that it starts by building a notion of citizenship that is inclusive. It's really ultimately that simple. Now, how do you do that, given our long history of not being able to do that? That's when it gets difficult. And I've heard people say, well, no, remember back in the early 20th century when it was like the Italians that were considered the second-class Americans and were excluded, and they managed, as their income started rising, as they started economic prosperity, that also they were kind of invited into the fold of white Americanism, what being white American was. And couldn't this happen to everybody? And frankly, I don't really think so, because I think one of the reasons that, like Italians were invited into the fold of whiteness in the Northeast was in part because African Americans arrived into the Northeast from the South and presented even a starker border. So I said, oh gosh, so let's bring these guys in and keep those guys out. And I really see, I don't see that there's kind of like a historical progression towards including others in this notion of what it is. So how do you do it? I mean, I could throw out some ideas. I think that we have to start with the places that we live. So that has to do with residential policy. People that live together will be able to see each other as people rather than as representative of groups, rather than representative of boxes of otherness. And so, you know, if we have, you know, some kind of like sane, rational, inclusive residential policy that kind of like the counter of redlining, you know, that is, that might start helping. And the same thing with educational policy. You know, if we had something that kind of like followed in the steps of Brown versus Board of Education and the many court cases that supported school integration, and that somehow they failed politically because of the opposition from you know, mostly quite suburban voters, but we did try some of these things, and I think that in many of them were very, very successful. And I would suggest trying them again. Sorry.
Let me follow up on that, just because you said some of them were very successful. So I think I would argue that it's hard to argue that we haven't made some progress. I'm not arguing that we're where we need to be or that we're where we think we are. But when I think about where we are now with respect to kind of race and ethnicity and other divisions, I just feel like we're in a very different place than we were 50 years ago. I know that's slow, but I'm old, so I'm patient. So what would you see as places where we have, would you agree that we have made progress on some things?
So could I point to a program? My dissertation was on Social Security. It came up in the book. I always go back to it. But let me point to that program, actually. So Laura pointed out, which is 100% correct, you know, the 35 Act, and in some ways, more importantly, the 39 amendments really excluded Black Americans from the program. You know, there's certain debates about this, but at the end of the day, large fractions of Black men and women were excluded from the program because they were either agriculture or domestic workers. They were eventually folded into the program under the 1950 amendments. And truth be told, in some ways, there are still some work on this. There's some deep problems with the design of Social Security in the ways that particularly advantages white men and women. But compared to other social welfare policies, it's a significant improvement. And I want to tell a story, though, because there's this fascinating story that actually revolves around the 1965 Medicare Act. So when Medicare was implemented in 1965, a good chunk of hospitals in the South were still segregated. And there had been battles about this actually going back to the 1950s, where the federal government had been trying to get these hospitals to desegregate. And the 65 Act gave this incredible weapon, which was enormous amounts of money for these hospitals, right, through the 65 Medicare Act. And the requirement was they had to desegregate, but there was a lot of concerns about whether or not they were really going to get these southern hospitals to actually desegregate. A good chunk of them just did. Like the money alone was like, all right, but there was like maybe somewhere, if I recollect correctly, up to 5% in the Deep South that were just completely resistant to desegregating these hospitals. And they had every trick in the book about how to do it. You know, an evaluator might show up and they would know they were coming, and they, you know, move people around into different rooms. They'd like, you know, all these tricks basically. So what the administration did was actually drew in the Social Security agency, the Social Security program. So you had all these Social Security agencies that were on the ground in thousands of communities around the country. And they had been embedded, the bureaucrats in those offices were embedded with the idea that the people who access Social Security have a basic right to these benefits. We need to treat them respectfully and treat them as full citizens. And they used the Social Security agencies in those communities in the Deep South to effectively go in and enforce the desegregation of those hospitals. And they pulled it off over the course of like 6 months, basically. Wow. They knew all the tricks. The logic was, though, they'd been trained to understand people in a very inclusive way. And the tagline to the end of the story is there's all this work now, post hoc, and that's been done in recent years that has shown that desegregation in the South of those hospitals led to dramatic reductions in infant mortality, in part because it gave people access to hospitals, babies who had dehydration issues associated with water quality and things like that. Anyway, the point is, right, like it's this sort of narrative about, yeah, we can actually leverage some tools that we actually do have to improve things. It's slow, it's incremental. I can point to 100 different other problems with Social Security, but there are glimmers along the way where we see improvements.
I'd answer the question a little bit differently, which is to say, you know, we have a lot of conflict today about history, the role of race, and how it connects to government. And that's sometimes portrayed as a negative, that we're arguing about identity politics. And I think part of what's happening is we're finding language to diagnose the problems. And that's language that generates some conflict. But you know, I'll take the example of using administrative burdens in the context of our book. When we started writing this book, what we saw was that people used similar sorts of problems in different policy areas. They would talk about, you know, difficulties in getting paperwork in EITC or SNAP, or problems with immigrants applying for visas, but without having a broader language or framework to see this as a broad policy problem, right? They would think of this, if this is an idiosyncratic thing that's happening in this particular policy area, maybe it's just happening in my state, I don't really understand why, rather than having a framework that helped them to understand, oh, this is not an accident, this is a means of rationalizing services, of making promises, going back to the social contract point in some cases, promising things that we won't actually deliver in practice. And I'm encouraged by the fact that, for example, in the area of social policy and voting, there has been this perennial discussion of fraud for as long as I've worked in the area of public policy and public management. And I see somewhat more pushback in the last 3 or 4 years where people are saying, yeah, but if you're going to stamp out all fraud, at what cost, right? What does this mean for things like access? Who are the people who are going to be most affected? What is the cost benefit analysis of the impact of what it is that you're doing? Talking about language and framework sounds very academic and very abstract, but that is really the way in which policymakers have presented these as problems to be solved in the past, right? If you only see fraud as the problem to be solved, you're going to come out at a very different place when it comes to accessibility of programs than if your starting point is, I want to make sure that everyone who's eligible for this program actually gets it. Those are two quite different logics that lead you to quite different places. But if you don't have the second logic in your mind, you're not going to make those choices. If you start by inferring the first logic as the only correct logic, we're going to get rid of fraud at all costs, then you end up with a very exclusive approach to designing programs, which is why we have, you know, somewhere between 1/3 to 2/3 of eligible beneficiaries not accessing many of our most important social programs.
If I could take this, start at this question with a narrow frame, I would entirely agree with you, Maria, that we have made progress. I'm thinking of, there's this great book called Children of the Dream by a Berkeley economist, Rucker Johnson, who studies educational policy. And he went and he looked at kids that had been going to school after desegregation and compared them to kids who'd gone to school before desegregation. And like the change was like enormous, gigantic. I mean, in terms of college attainment and completion, a work later in life and wages later in life and marriage and odds of going to jail, it was amazing. And there's a line somewhere in the book that says, people ask me how long, how many generations it will take us to get to where we want to be. And he answers, the evidence in this book says just one. But what happened? We stopped. So the question really isn't, are there not interventions that can take us to these, but we have to have the political will to follow them through. We stopped the segregation. In fact, right now, the flavor of the day is resegregation. You have all these affluent neighborhoods segregating from broader school districts to take advantage of a Supreme Court decision that said that you didn't have to integrate across school district lines. And so, you know, suddenly these big, diverse urban school districts are being deprived of their funds because the rich suburbs are just peeling off. Rich suburbs, which, by the way, tend to be mostly white, or at least much more white than that. And there's again and again, we've seen these efforts that then we stop. And I wanted to refer to Pam's bringing up of Medicare in 1965. And the vast decline in infant mortality since then. But to point out that, you know, Medicare was probably the last of the programs, and Medicaid, that were kind of inspired by this ethos that came from the New Deal. Because right then in 1965, we switched speed and declared the war on crime. And the public money stopped going into these things like in health insurance and started going into prisons, and which led us, and prisons became like the tool of social management. It's where we put, you know, what we declared was our dysfunction. And today, by the way, our infant mortality rate is way better than it was in 1965, but you know, we're roughly on par with Croatia. You know, we're like in 37th place compared to countries that we might consider our peers. And then just to end, to kind of like with referring to Don's idea that we need to see this as a whole, because I'm just a journalist and I normally just go and I look at data points and say, okay, this is my evidence for this and that and the other. And so it's by nature kind of narrow. But, you know, if you look at the kind of like the whole spectrum of health and social and social outcomes in the United States, the collective picture that this paints, from life expectancy to infant and maternal mortality to teen pregnancy to suicide rates to incarceration, all of them are dismal. And so, of course, you know, it would be kind of naive to say, oh, yeah, well, it's that we have like 27 individual problems that are unrelated. Well, no, this is part of, it's one story. And it just has all these multifaceted outcomes.
Just to back up your point from Eduardo, I mean, there is, right, like there's a robust, I think there's a robust evidence base that the kind of end of the expansion of the welfare state in broad ways was a function of the 1960s and the backlash basically to the expansion of social welfare benefits for Black people in the US. That as people pushed harder to get access to these benefits that they hadn't had access to before, you started to see this sort of big backlash against those programs. So it's not, yeah.
So do you see the current confluence of crises? Because it is a confluence of crises, right? With our democratic institutions and our economy and our kind of the issues around the mobilization around racial justice and the issues about our response or lack of response to COVID. Do you see any potential for a pivot point in this?
You want to go first, Don? You look like you were itching to jump there, but
the way of looking at millions of people who found themselves signing up for unemployment for the first time and being introduced to an aspect of the administrative state that they had no idea about, and realizing, wow, this is not an easy or helpful process, is that maybe that creates some sense of a community with people that they might normally not find a sense of community with, but also some political pressure to do better with these systems. And I think that there are technical fixes we can talk about. There are things like leveraging administrative data. The state is great at collecting data about who you are, and is really bad about then sharing that data to different parts of it, so to make it easier for you as a citizen. But combining administrative data with information technology, if you can fix the privacy concerns, you can shift a lot of burdens away from people, so they don't have to wait for hours in line or spend lots of time providing the same information again and again. But to get to that point, you have to have the political willingness to make those technologies feasible. And so, if you ask what's the difference between us and Denmark, in Denmark, they basically agree. If you're liberal or if you're conservative, you still basically agree that everyone should have health insurance. And once you agree on that, then you can figure out how to make it work pretty well. If you don't agree on that basic principle, then you're going to be fighting over the means for a long, long time. And so there's one scenario here where what we'll see moving forward is blue states or blue cities much more actively embrace solutions to reduce administrative burdens and make it easier for people to access parts of the safety net, and red states not doing that. Or you may see something at the federal level where, for example, the Biden campaign has talked about using food stamp data to help auto enrollment for Medicaid. That's like a nice technological solution that builds on the ethos of, we have the data, why not make it easier for people? But I think that requires just a very different conversation at the federal level than we've seen about the role of government over the last 20 or 30 years. And that's not a criticism of any particular party. I think both parties haven't really thought about how do we build government in a way that it puts the human at the center of the story and builds around helping them. And instead has been focused more on, how do we build these management systems? How do we measure performance? How do we identify fraud and eliminate that? So I think it takes a different worldview to get to that point at the federal level.
John, I would argue that it would also take a different view of government. So, I mean, now you've touched on one of my favorite topics. So, but, one of the things that's different between Denmark and the US is that in Denmark, government has much greater access to data about people than private corporations do. And in the US, we are much more willing to sign away our privacy to get a credit card or to be tracked so that we can, get around the traffic jam. So we'll let Google know where we are. But we feel much less comfortable with government knowing where we've been, say, to be able to track whether we might have been exposed to COVID. Or my credit card will, help me with my travel plans because they've taken information from the airplane ticket I would have bought before the pandemic and other information and use that to share services. But I think many Americans are very nervous about the idea of the government taking information about a program that I might have applied to over here and using that, even if it is to, from the government's perspective, offer me another benefit over there. So some of it's about government ability or willingness to innovate, but a lot of it is also about the stories we tell ourselves about government and the view that we have of government, and therefore what we're willing to let government do. That would be, as a former government bureaucrat.
I do, but I think that, so I think the part of the big issue here, and partly why I've really come around, like why I care so much now about, administrative burden and the kind of barriers that people encounter, is really shapes your view of what government can and can't do. Even if you get Medicaid, right? Like even if you have access to Medicaid, which a third, right? 34% of children, that's how they get their health insurance. It's this critical support, but if all of your interactions are negative, right? Like if every time, you get 30 forms and someone always is trying to kick you off the program, and the experience that people have, a lot of people have on a daily basis with these critical programs. And it very much shapes them, people's sense of what they're willing to let government, what kind of, I suspect it has an influence on what kind of information they're willing to give to government, but more importantly, just their sense of what it can do and then what they think the possibilities are. And the reality is there's a lot of experiences people have on a daily basis, which are really bad, in part because of what Don pointed out in terms of because, we largely just worry about fraud. We don't spend much time worrying, at least for some programs, what that experience is like.
So go ahead, Eduardo.
I would like to take just a little step back from this and go back to the comparison between the United States and Denmark. One thing that's very clear in the United States, difference between the United States and Denmark, is that at least until fairly recently and throughout the construction of their welfare state, the Danes were always big, white, blonde people. And so the role of government of redistributing within this group of big, white, blonde people was giving stuff from one big, white, blonde person to another big, white, blonde person. And in the United States, that experience has been very not that. In the United States, these barriers of race have gotten in the way of this notion of, of we're all one, of solidarity. And because it's the government that is essentially the institution that is in charge of redistribution, that I think that I would argue that this original racial animus, mistrust, fear, this body of tribal feelings is one of the basic reasons that in the United States government, there's so little trust in government as an institution as a whole. And so, thinking about how this could improve, about do we get to a better place? I think that there are better odds that the Danes go into a bad place because they're experiencing a lot of immigration from Northern Europe and the Middle East, than that we move into a good place. I mean, given our past experience.
So much for optimism. So Eduardo, I'm going to ask you a question about the role of media in helping push us to a better view of government and our collective action. I'm going to give you a minute to think about that while I remind our audience that you can share questions with us by typing them into the questions section of your panel. And I have a question, but first, before I go to the first audience question, I want to ask Eduardo the question of, we've talked a couple of, each of you has kind of touched on this idea of the stories, and I have as well, the stories we tell ourselves about government, the view that we have of government and our capacity, and also the stories we tell about who we are, right? And what that relationship should be like. One place where those stories get told is in the press. And we've had a lot of conversations about both the responsibility of the press to kind of elevate and improve our dialogue, and then maybe some of the challenges that contemporary press has had in terms of the way we talk about ourselves and to each other. So as the professional on the call, what would you share with us?
Yeah. So, okay, as you point out, I work for the press, so please forgive my biases. And okay, the media has for sure a hand in the decline in public trust in so many institutions in this country. From government to science to the soundness of the American electoral process. And I was just very recently, interesting, I read this analysis of how come New Zealand's politics were so stable compared to ours and even to Britain's or Australia's. And one of the reasons that seemed to make sense to me was that they were discussing there was that it didn't have a Murdoch-owned media organization. And so, yeah, and I kind of I could sympathize with that. This is an organization that is driving very, very extreme propositions out there and with a lot of clout. But I want to go a little further, because when thinking about the media's role, one must think about really what we mean by media. And I don't think that right now the story of America's declining trust and its intense polarization is driven only by these corporate media barons like, you know, Fox and the New York Times. Because let's think about it, this is happening, this kind of polarization, this decline in trust is happening at a time when the media landscape has really splintered into a, you know, a multitude of actors with diverging interests, diverging worldviews, and actually pretty depressingly also multiple pathologies. So part of what is happening is not like the big media Goliaths putting down their foot, is that the corporate media that once acted as a gatekeeper of the truth, kind of like bound by some sort of professional ethic, has been cast aside. And this has allowed for a proliferation of competing truths out there, you know, driven by all these competing agendas. And this, you know, there's this social scientist at NYU, Jonathan Haidt, who uses this term motivated thinking. And I think that part of what's happening is that motivated thinking has taken over the truth, kind of like in the absence of these guardrails that used to exist that kind of like set some kind, there was some rough consensus view on what the reality out there looked like. And then you could have different opinions that you would foist upon that. Well, now we have motivated realities, and there's any number of outlets that will say that, you know, there's, yeah, a bunch of pedophiles in the pizzeria. And you will hold that as a truth, and you'll build your worldview based on that. And so the guardrails that could hem in our public discourse and just gave way. And now we can believe in whatever world we want to believe, you know, where vaccines do this and COVID doesn't exist. And then just the final thought is that the media, I'm sure, is surely a player in this process, but I would think twice about how important a player and whether it is a driver of this process or not. Because the process that has split this country, you know, where, you know, the big divide, the Republican Party kind of like has become the party of older white workers without a college degree in small town and rural America, and the Democratic Party has become this party of younger, diverse urban America. This is a process that has been going on for half a century. And so see, it's kind of like this selection, this polarization of America into competing views of the world kind of has gone on for a very, very long time. And I think it's motivated not just but by what people read, I mean, in the newspapers or on Facebook.
So I pick up Eduardo's point. He mentioned sort of one psychological bias that we have, which is motivated reasoning, and that affects what information we consume and how much weight we give to that information, such that we tend to weight information that fits with our political beliefs more heavily and give it more credibility. But there's another basic psychological bias that I think affects how media covers these issues, which is loss aversion, which is that human beings are just more motivated to pay attention to bad news rather than good news. And the story of failure or fraud or disaster is always going to generate more attention than the stories of a well-run government program, right? It's a hard reality if you run government programs. If you do your job well, your reward is you don't end up in the newspaper most of the time. And I've run some experiments where we've given members of the public or elected officials performance data and asked them, to make decisions based on that data. And you can see the same pattern. If the performance data shows bad performance, they're much more interested and motivated by that information than they care about data about good performance. And so assuming that's a reality, how can the media help? I think it can help by identifying problems of the type that we're describing. And so I think, in some ways, we're in this sort of golden age of investigative reporting about government programs and how they work, because we have this generation of journalists who are incredibly good at using data, visualizing the data, telling that story in a way that connects to individuals. The work that, I think the Times, the Post, ProPublica does about in-depth government programs is amazing, right? And my deepest concern is that those resources, you find them right at the top of the media food chain at those places, while they're disappearing from state and local government reporting in particular. And so, we spent a long time in Wisconsin, and you could see the shrinking of coverage of the Capitol by people who really paid close attention to how programs work, and that's a real disservice. So organizations like ProPublica, which have more of a nonprofit foundational approach to managing the media, have hired local government reporters now. I don't know if that's the future, but it's a future. If you pull media out of those state and local settings, we're just not going to know where the problems are occurring ahead of time. And that is, identifying those problems is actually sort of a positive way to think about how the media responds to that loss aversion that we all have.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about, right, you're comparing the US welfare state, for example, and US outcomes compared to Europe. Really, you should be talking about states. I mean, individual states policy-wise are so different from each other. If you live in Texas versus you live in California or New York State, it's like living in different countries. And yeah, not having enough exposure to what's going on, even at just a pure policy perspective in those places, is not a great thing.
We have a question that kind of picks up on this, not on the media part, but on asking, if we have moved in the US from a culture, kind of a great society culture, to a culture of scarcity, of fear, of kind of loss aversion, fewer services that work well, who will provide the goal or the vision of kind of a new government model or culture? What would be the defining difference, for example, between future administration? So if the press is one, but how else are we going to kind of get a new roadmap?
Gosh. Okay, let's solve it all here. Let's fix this.
You first, Eduardo.
Well, I mean, I frankly think that the ACA was an attempt to move us out of the kind of like the path that we had followed since Richard Nixon to George W. Bush, in which the movement was towards reducing programs, making them harder to get, demonizing the people that receive the benefits, all these work requirements and all that stuff. And so the ACA is an attempt to kind of like, whoa, we need this universal right. There's this universal benefit that we should actually have. And so it was one step, turned out to be an extremely fragile step. But I would say a very important inflection point that then got, slammed to the ground by the following administration. Now, could a Biden administration kind of like pick that up and try to moving? I mean, if you talk to people that work in his camp, you see all sorts of ideas that would, piecemeal, gradually, universal child benefit is one actually excellent idea that I think has a lot of traction with his people. Strengthening the ACA, adding a public option. But there's a variety of things that you could do to try to. I don't have a lot of confidence that this moves us into, again, a Lyndon Johnson equilibrium, if you will. I think that our politics are definitely not there. And I think, just specifically about the next administration, I think that the Democratic Party that's going to be calling the shots is going to be more a purple kind of Virginia, is going to be the marginal vote in Congress. It's not going to be Queens. And so the kind of like the ambition is going to be determined, I think, by this kind of political reality.
One of the things that we talk about with the book and in general is precisely because of the at the congressional level, the difficulty of getting anything done at the congressional level, the executive branch, you can actually do a lot, right? Like, I mean, the main way that Trump has undermined the ACA is just using executive branch tactics, a lot of which are just burdens, Biden can undo that stuff. I mean, if you think about it this way, if 1 in every 5 people who's supposed to get SNAP doesn't get those benefits, if 1 of every 5 people who's supposed to get the EITC doesn't get those benefits, and it gets worse when you look at other programs, the executive branch can do a lot to increase access to really critical social welfare benefits if it really decides it's going to do that. It actually has the capacity and it has the authority to do it. So I'm not saying like, I don't need to exclude, like we need a lot of congressional action. I'm just sort of saying like, this is like low hanging fruit, actually. I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying it's possible in a way that it's a bit more murky with Congress.
So I really appreciate the time that everybody has taken and kind of this very engaging conversation. I want to, since Eduardo points out the difficulty of accomplishing, though, Pam, you gave us good examples of what might be accomplished in the short run. I'd like to close by asking if you would have, given that we have 3 minutes, fairly brief suggestions, but suggestions nonetheless. Look beyond the next 4 years, whatever they might look like, and imagine that we are 20 years from now, and that we are looking back and we have really made progress. We have really made progress. Things are better than they were in 2020. Might be a low bar. A lot better than they were in 2020. What's different, and what were the key things that got us here? What's one important thing that got us here?
So
this better place that we'll be.
I'll start, and it'll pick up on Pam's point a little bit. I think progressives love a politics of building new things, and I think a more modest politics of fixing things that are in place, making government work as a theme for progressive politics would actually get us much further than you might expect. And I think if you can build success stories, maybe starting in blue states and blue cities, but also maybe in some red states and red cities too, where people access a program that works pretty well for them, they'll be reluctant to give that up, or that'll at least change the conversation a little bit. Obamacare has had its problems, but it's changed people's perceptions about what they should reasonably expect in terms of healthcare. And now we're having conversations about Medicare for all or getting rid of Obamacare, but there's at least a population who thinks, okay, it's not unreasonable to expect most of us should have healthcare and it shouldn't be god-awful difficult to get it, right? And so I think that focusing on the implementation, the ethos of making implementation work and fixing things is sort of an untapped area of power if you actually believe in government fixing the safety net.
Thank you. Eduardo?
You're gonna hate me for this, but you know, I'm gonna have to point out that 20 years from now is roughly the time when the United States becomes a minority-majority country. And the process of the United States becoming a minority-majority country is, I think, gonna be the driving force of American politics over the next 20 years, or a very important driving force of American policy. I think it is an important part of what gave us a presidency of Donald Trump. And regardless of what happens next week, I think it will be a very, very important power that is going to be resisting this change. And the manifestation of the resistance to this change is going to be through the idea of limiting redistribution, limiting the size of government, you know, the same. And so breaking, if you want to ask me, what do we do? That's what we've got to break. So I take it above the technocratic level to the, it's about building a notion that of cohesive Americanness that happens despite this ethnic demographic change. And I guess there's ways that you can do that. I mean, there's Dowell Myers, a guy at USC, a demographer and urbanist. He says, well, you know, maybe because all these white boomer retirees are going to require it on a workforce of color to support the economy that they depend on, that might provide grounds for it to change the conversation about, you know, how we relate to each other and build something more inclusive. And yeah, urban America is going to become much more diverse, and the young, diverse urban America is one of the few things that inspires in me a little bit of hope about being able to build these new discourses.
Perfect. I'm going to ask you to stop right there because you stopped on a positive note. Pam, I'm going to give you the last word.
No, I think we should end with our Eduardo. I think that's a nice, we'll end on a positive note.
That's perfect. Well, I so appreciate this conversation, and to me, it feels like a beginning of a conversation, not the end, but it's just so clear. I learned a lot from each of you, and I really appreciate kind of the perspectives that you shared, and the ideas. And, you know, I left this conversation more optimistic, and certainly about the importance of the project, right? The importance of the project. And you can't solve a problem that you haven't identified, right? So we have identified some of the issues, you know, what doesn't work, and some of the kind of fundamental issues that maybe motivate us to not fix government, you know, or stand in the way of our fixing government. So that is kind of our project. I say our, like the folks here on the screen, and I believe the folks on this call and at the McCourt School is thinking about that, how to move forward, how to improve our capacity for collective action and to make things better for all of us. So thanks to our panelists for sharing their perspectives, whether they were optimistic or not. And thanks to everybody for joining us on this call. We really appreciate your being part of this community.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.